Guardians?
Oh,
What do I do?
no.
Should I try and send it to you?
Send it to Alan. He can post it in the chat easier than I can.
Well, why don't I just post it in the chat when you tell
There
me?
you go.
That's terrifying,
you're
but I'm
getting-
going to try.
You're getting better and better at this. All right, let's see what we got. Okay, we already have people are starting to roll in.
Okay, so I've got the Guardians thing. I could put it in for you now, actually. How about I do that now?
Okay. Well, Margot's here, I see.
I can't see.
Paul Earnshaw. Paul, we might have to pull you up to have some conversation with you. So hang out, please.
Yeah, I can't see who's in. How can I tell?
Yeah, it's weird on the iPad because I have to pull up all these different windows. We got about 5 minutes. We'll just greet everybody and welcome everybody.
Yeah, so and you're not planning on starting like we used to, with you and I just saying a few things as we open. You're just going to dive straight into chatting to Terry, which is fine.
Yeah, just got to wait for her to show up.
Okay. I can see Margot's with us.
Yeah.
And Jihan is here, but I don't know where you're from, Jihan.
The run sheet you sent, Joel, says that you and Steve would start with structure. Are you throwing that? Are you tossing that?
We're gonna have some structure. We just kind of went through it. We just got to wait. We got to make sure that hopefully the Terry got the time change right.
Yeah,
if not, then we'll just start. Alan, we'll just keep going from here.
Yeah.
And then she'll come in when she joins in.
You've got a okay. I won't start trying to suggest a different way, but I quite like structure if you can get it together. Remember,
how much structure do you want?
Well, let's have a panel at the end. Let's bring people in, and you've
absolutely.
You've got Alan with it.
Do you want to start with me not present? Is just the two of you kind of structuring and doing the usual, and then you could bring me up.
Let's just see. Let's see who all shows up. We'll see if Terry gets here on time.
Yeah, Alan, you're just going to have to be extrovert here, man.
All I know is we have a very robust group of people coming in.
Yeah,
and so I think we're going to have lots of things to talk about.
Yeah, and Alfie from West Wales is here. He's been our most regular attender.
Yeah.
And I'd just like to point out there's a violent outbreak of sunshine in Wales.
Hey, Fiona. A violent outbreak of sunshine.
A sudden and violent outbreak of sunshine, unannounced.
I remember being in Seattle and they'd go outside and take sun breaks when the sun came out. Like whatever you're doing, if you can get away from your desk, go outside, the sun shines.
That's the immense sacrifice I'm making here this afternoon.
I'm going to get a refill on my coffee just before we start. So just 30
seconds.
Yeah.
No, we need you coffeeed up, Alan.
Yep.
Hello, Fiona. What do we got?
Yeah, it's sweat from all over.
Yeah, no. It's weird doing this on an iPad because I have to pull down everybody as they go, as they come in. So Steve, if you can monitor the chat a little bit and see if there are any questions or people you'd like to promote, that'd be great. I think you're co-host. You can promote whoever you want.
I don't know how to promote. Okay, so
you click on their name, I think, and then it'll give you a bunch of different options.
I might ask you to do the promoting, but I'll definitely keep an eye. Okay.
Yeah, I just figured out how to do it.
Settings. Hillary's giving me some advice. Hillary, it's you're brave. That's all I'll say, Hillary.
What, to give you advice?
Yeah, but she's actually saying something out. The usual settings that show speaker names and offer options to see the audience aren't available to me. Should I worry? Oh, she's asking a question there. Sorry, Hilary, I misunderstood you. Joel, I think you do well to catch
The webinar, because this is a webinar, Hillary won't be able to see, will only be able to see the panel. That's the way webinars are structured.
Yeah.
I think that's what the question is.
See, there's another Brit from Brixton in London, Ford Hickson, talking about a violent outbreak of sunshine. Okay, so it's.
Yeah. Well, we got Dr. Wagner with us now.
You might want to bring him in. There's the boykie.
We'll just give Terry another minute.
Yeah.
Well, hello from Northern Ohio. Well, hello from Gold Coast, Australia. Let's see if.
Yeah, Kirsty, there's also a violent outbreak in Manchester. Yeah. Yeah.
Tobias. Well, if we got the time change wrong for Terry, that means she'll come in at the second hour. So that'll be fine.
Yeah.
All right. So you ready to get going, Steve?
I'm ready to get going.
I'm ready to get going. I've been waiting for this conversation for a year.
But can I just say that Amjad from Libya is here. And Amjad, that is a first. That is awesome, Amjad. So pleased to know you're joining us. I think that is a first. And Connor Grant, goeiemiddag. I think that is from the Netherlands, Connor. Don't try and con me. I don't think you're South African. I think it's Dutch. I can tell by the way you spell goeie. You don't spell it right, man. But lovely to have you, Amjad, from Libya. Do tell us what you do and how come you're on here, Amjad. It's so good to know that you're with us.
Absolutely.
And David Price, I see, is there. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You remember David? David, you have some questions for us.
So we might bring you in a bit later, David. Okay.
Hello, Robert O'Driscoll. Wow, we got a whole crew here. This is great.
Greetings, Robert. Yeah,
All
David,
right.
we'll bring you in.
We'll wait a couple more minutes.
Yeah.
Well, we usually get about what, 30% of the people that register, and then people watch it on their own time. Oh, let me live stream right quick.
You notice all the Brits, they always comment on the weather. Do you notice that? There's Gabby from Leeds. We're all obsessed about it, right? Because of this violent outbreak of sunshine. Jess Branch from Kenya. How lovely to know you with us, Jess. When I last saw you, it was sunny and we were sitting together, and there you are in Kenya, hey? Lovely to know you with us, Jess. You're a psychiatrist, Amjad. Please get in touch with me because we are doing a series called Am I in Africa, Amjad? Please get in touch with me. That's in a couple of weeks, eh?
It's on the 20th, isn't it?
Kate Speck. Oh, there's a proper one. Beverly Bolton from, she's proper, I can tell. You proper South African, Beverly. From the Bay.
We have somebody I just saw coming in from Egypt.
Abir, do get in touch with me as well, Abir, about that African initiative. Okay. Hi, Caro from down the road. Goeiedag, Beverly.
All right, Steve, let's kick it into gear.
Let's do it because.
Let's do it. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, all right.
Let's
go.
Welcome,
everybody. Well, welcome, everybody. Welcome to the MI and Beyond webinar. This is our March episode, so to speak. I'm Joel Porter, and I'm here with Steve Rolnick, Alan Zukoff, and Chris Wagner. hopefully Terry Moyeres will be joining us. All these international time changes, things mix around, but we are so honored that that y'all showed up. So I'm Joel. I am in Gold Coast, Australia. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm an MI guide, and I've just been having a grand time hanging out with Steve this past year, doing these webinars every month. Steve, I'll pass it over to you.
Hello, greetings. My name's Steve Rolnick. I'm sitting here in Cardiff, Wales. I come from South Africa, originally clinical psychologist, and I've been involved with motivational interviewing, one school of therapy, for probably 30, 40 years, but I'm beginning to seriously doubt some of the journeys I've been on, and that's the purpose of today's webinar. So I'm looking forward to it very much.
All right. Alan, you want to do an introduction?
Sure. I'm Alan Zukoff. I'm here in Red Bank, New Jersey, at the northern end of the New Jersey shore of in the US. And I am a clinical psychologist, also not involved with MI, not quite as long as Steve, but over several decades, and have done a great deal of work integrating MI with other forms of therapy in research settings. I was for a couple of decades at the University of Pittsburgh in the departments of psychiatry and psychology, and most of my research focused on questions about how do we integrate or use or adapt or blend MI with other methods for helping people with a variety of problems.
Cool. Dr. Wagner. We can't hear you.
Hello, how about now?
There you
Microphone
go.
would help. Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Wagner. Nice to see you all. Good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever, nighttime, whatever it might be for you. My background's clinical psychology. I came to motivational interviewing a while back. I've got a little wear and tear on me, but like other people, through other pathways, other routes that led me to MI. So in a way, it's always been, MI has been the integration into practice I was doing before and helped provide a springboard kind of moving forward. But overall, I'd say I'm just still learning to talk to people. Or Steve, I should say talk with people.
Talk with people. Absolutely. Absolutely. Steve, do you want to say a little bit about the Guardians before we get into all this?
Yeah, and I'll put the URL into the chat line. Into the chat line, I put the URL to a project in Cape Town in South Africa, which we on the MI and Beyond webinar series support. So we offer this free, but we ask you in return to be brave and bold and to click on that URL and to trust us that what is going on in that project is something very, very special. Okay. It's in one of the most violent townships in Cape Town, South Africa, where we have a link with its founder, Ralph Bovers. We're not going to show a video today, but towards the end of the webinar, before we close down, we'll remind you again. And you've just got to click onto that URL. And if you've enjoyed the webinar, or even if you're excited about it beforehand, just click on that and donate whatever pennies you like. You can trust me that what Ralph does is something special. The money goes directly out into the field. And if you like, it's a social action project that is designed to heal a community in poverty. And the healing forces take a number of directions. And it's special, as you'll see if you explore that website. So thank you very much, Joel.
Absolutely. No, I just want to second that. And, you know, there's no donation that's too small, because it all goes straight back into the community. Okay, well, a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. What we're going to do is we're going to have a conversation, and we're going to talk about blending approaches, not only therapies, but other approaches, because I know we have people, you know, working in working in education, working in corrections, working in sports, about what are the benefits of stepping outside of our usual approaches and looking beyond what we might think about as ways of helping people. We're going to do our best not to sound like clinical psychologists. We've promised that to Steve.
I did not make that. I did not make that promise, Joel. I just want to be really clear.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll do the best I can to interpret what Alan says. But Terry, if you're out there and you're looking to get in, let us know when you're here. Just come on in and join the conversation. So we're gonna have a chat. We're gonna see where it goes, and then we're going to do what we usually do at the end. We're going to open it up for questions and invite people to come on board and join us. I know I'd love to hear what Paul Earnshaw has to say, because I know he signed in. So if you stick around, Paul, I'm going to promote you to panelist. But what I thought I would do is, since we do have Steve with us, and as I was saying earlier, that if I could be sitting in a pub right now with these three men and we could have this conversation, I'd be over the moon. But maybe we'll start a little bit, Steve, just kind of having a conversation with you, particularly about what your thoughts are on blending approaches, and how you and Bill Miller thought about motivational interviewing, and how you put it together. Because I can remember at a Mint forum, maybe I dreamt this, but I'm pretty sure I heard Bill Miller say it, that he thought motivational interviewing was about 98% Carl Rogers and 2% other. So I'm just kind of wondering about, the chance encounter that the two of you have that's ended up becoming motivational interviewing, is how did you have that conversation about creating or developing this thing called motivational interviewing? How did that unfold?
Yeah, but do you think before we start, we can just clarify what we're talking about, Joel?
Yeah.
Since it is a little bit like, you like to feel like we're in a pub somewhere and we're in a bar, that so it's that relaxed. So can I just interrupt you, and can I ask you to clarify? Oh, there are all these different schools of therapy and counseling. Is that right? And you are concerned about the fact that they sit in separate silos, and that wouldn't it be a good idea if they were integrated more? Is that correct? Is that what?
Yes.
Okay. Can I just raise 2 points before we get into MI, motivational interviewing talk? One is this word blending, and your reference to cocktail, which might be because you were imagining we were in a bar, okay? But the reference to blending a cocktail suggests that you just get everything together and you shake it up, okay? And then you get what, okay? And I'm not sure blending is the right word, okay? So I'm not, right from the beginning, I want to say, I'm not sure that we want to throw the baby with the bathwater, whatever the phrase is. I think there is a case for specialist focus where skilled people focus on particular things, okay? So
yep.
Cocktail blending might not be quite the right word, the right image to have, but we still have a problem with these separate silos. And I think I'll be very interested to know whether our friends, Alan and Chris and all the people here, actually believe that this is a good idea. Okay, I don't want to polarize it, but I think it's so flawed. Okay, so I'm in a state of conflict. Okay, Joel, because on the one hand, I think this is very flawed. And on the other hand, there's a case for a specialist focus. And I don't know how to resolve it. And I hope that in the course of this webinar, we're going to come up with some potential resolution. So I wanted to say that from the beginning, you know what I mean? Am I making sense, Joel, or is this too?
You're making sense. You're making sense to me. I mean, I'll just want to jump in and go. But
Okay.
I think it's a good idea to back up and unpack it a little bit.
Okay. And then can I say one more thing before we talk about MI? because I'm
Certainly.
weary of leaping into the very silos that have caused the problem in the first place, which is that inside me is a very fluid and flexible, I like to think a fluid and flexible person who can respond to the needs of people in front of me. So I don't have purist MI in my forehead, okay? And it'll be very interesting to listen out for, particularly with people like Alan Zakhoff, who's with us, Chris Wagner's with us on the screen, and many others. They are quiet, silent integrationists, I suspect, okay? I've got a feeling that they are, right? Alan has already made a reference to this. Chris did as well, right? And those two people have inspired me beyond any words that I can use, okay, to think more broadly and to get out of the silos. So we've got a brilliant opportunity now to go, okay, so what does it mean to jump out of the silo? Okay, what does it actually mean? Okay, if we had a nice way to think about it, Joel, let's imagine there's a group of newly green counselors or practitioners who want to get involved in helping people, and they're in the room next door. What are we going to go and teach them? Okay, are we going to go and teach them a silo, just one silo, or are we going to teach them something else? And what is that something else? Now, I've got some answers to that, as I'm sure you guys do, but I just raise that as a question. Okay, can I have one final rant, Joel?
Absolutely, Steve.
Okay, and then we can talk MI if you want to, but then I'll maybe keep quiet and see what other people think. Okay, what about the recipients? Here is a group, here's a group of experts and psychologists and all these people. What about the recipients? Okay, and now this is where I'll get serious. I think it is nothing short of a tragic, the way arrogant, professionally pompous psychologists, often, they're not always, psychiatrists, have constructed these silos without paying adequate attention to the needs of the recipients. And so what you have is what I had out here in the rare outbreak of Welsh Sunshine, a friend of mine saying, look, my partner's been sexually abused as a kid. Can you help me work out who she should see? Okay, complete confusion, right? No sense of, and we live in a small, fairly close-knit community in the small city, right? They're completely at sea as to who they should see, why, and why, okay? And I suspect that kind of conversation is replicated worldwide, and it's our singular failing that we haven't been able to reach out to people with a clear sense of what helpfulness means, okay, and how they can get it. So, bang, end of my rant. I've raised a few questions, right? So if you want to talk about MI, you can do it. I'm sorry, Joel, have I rocked the
No,
boat?
not at all, man, not at all. No, I was just thinking of MI as a starting point of a much broader conversation.
Yeah, this is yeah.
But what you're doing is you're taking it to a whole nother level.
I thought that's what you wanted to talk about, blending, okay? Now, the reference you made was, I think, to Bill and I meeting and what happened there. And I think what excites you still is the fact that it was a blending of sorts did take place where we brought together non-directive and directive, if you like, or non-directive and purposeful, or I don't know how you want to present it. What was it? Client-centered and directive. We brought that together.
No. Well, in the States, the whole debate was directive and non-directive therapy.
Correct. And that happened in a motor car. It happened in a motor car. Okay, and I can tell you the story because I remember the motor car and the drive.
Let's hear a little bit of the story. I don't think I'm the only one that'd be interested in it.
Yeah. Bill and I didn't construct motivational interviewing together. I think we failed to understand the influences on Bill. Okay, Bill wrote this paper in 1983. Okay, and I read it and I was training people, and I had my own very personal reasons why motivational interviewing made sense. And I'll be happy to speak to those very personal experiences if I'm bold enough, because we're in a bar and I've had a drink or two. Okay. So,
Next round's on me.
Okay, man. But Bill came into that, I think, very influenced by Mansell Patterson. Okay, who was a great human being. I haven't read much about Mansell Patterson, but I do remember him independently in the addictions field back in the late 60s and early 70s. Okay, so I think Bill was very influenced not just by Rogers, but by Mansell Patterson. Okay, and so there were influences on Bill, and he wrote this paper, and then we met. Motivational interviewing had already been formulated. And all he and I did, or all I did, was encourage him to go deeper and to polish a jewel. Okay, it was very rough cut, which was why I persuaded him to write a book on it. I wanted him to write the book, not me, but then he invited me into the process. Okay, we were in a car having run the very first workshop on motivational interviewing together for trainers, and it was in Santa Fe. So this is, you've got to fast forward 10 years, okay? And we were driving through the deserts outside Santa Fe, and I said to Bill, okay, tell me what motivational interviewing is, because we'd had what was a pretty difficult few days with the first motivational interviewing trainers workshop, and it was all over the place. Okay, it really was all over the place. People mostly interpreted what we were doing as client-centered counseling. Okay, and I said to him, you tell me what motivational interviewing is, because I don't think it's just client-centered counseling, and they've misunderstood us. So he spoke for a while, and I just said, look, it sounds like it's both client-centered and directive. And he said, no, that's it. So I said, well, why don't we write a tiny little paper, just a few pages that clarifies that? And we did. And I think it was called What is Motivational Interviewing? And it went into the same journal that had produced his original paper. So that's one answer to, your historical query. But I do think it's more than just the way that this is more than just about directive and client-centered at the same time. I think there were other forces from, as I say, from Mansell Patterson's work on resistance. I think a lot of it came from that. But, I know Alan Zukoff will know, and Chris Wagner will know more about Patterson's work than I do, because I believe they are secret, quiet integrationists. And I've got one other story, but I'm a bit irritated with this subject, to be honest.
Yeah. So just for the record, Steve, the reason I put blending together, because it sounded better with a cocktail. And I didn't want to say psychotherapy integration because it sounded more psychologist oriented. And I was trying to be clever with the title. I'm not wedded to a blended cocktail, just so you know.
I knew you wouldn't be. It was just, you couldn't help the barroom image and metaphor.
No, not with you lot. Alan, what do you think? Where are you at with this conversation so far?
That's a broad question, Joel. It's a dangerous question to ask me such a broad question. I can go in different directions.
It's intentional.
I'll just say a few things and you'll stop me when I've said enough. So certainly you're right, Steve, at least about me, that I am a psychotherapy integrationist. And I'd say probably not that silent about it, or maybe not as loud about it as I might be. I started as a purist, but and I was trained psychodynamically and with client-centered and psychodynamic practices, a kind of humanistic version of dynamic therapy. And I was enough of a purist that in the very first treatment research study I participated in as a psychodynamic psychotherapist working with people with cocaine addiction, which was comparing dynamic therapy, cognitive therapy, and traditional drug counseling. This is a multi-site study sponsored by NIDA in the US in the early 90s. I passed an office where a bunch of the cognitive therapists were talking with each other, ducked my head in, and I said, cognitive therapy is the devil. And I kept going. And at the time, I really meant it. I said it lightly, but meant it. I believed at the time, as many dynamic therapists did, and those who were around long enough remember the intense rivalry and hostility between cognitive and behavioral therapy and psychodynamic psychotherapy. So I think when we talk about psychotherapy integration now, it's hard, unless you were there at the time, it's hard to remember or even to be aware of how much the idea of psychotherapy integration was radical at the time. The dynamic therapist hated the behavior therapist. The behavior therapist had contempt for the dynamic therapists. The humanistic therapists thought they were all nuts. The third force model. And I think we've come a very long way since then, is what I really want to say. And the only thing I'll say one more thing and stop myself. For me, what actually led me out of my purist mentality was motivational interviewing. Because MI, I swore that when Joel invited me to be part of this panel, I would get this story in early. So I'm going to tell it briefly.
Go.
Because I think it's important. Many of you know Hal Arkowitz or know of Hal Arkowitz. Hal, and you mentioned influences, Steve. Hal was, as many of you know, one of Bill's teachers in graduate school. And he was a prominent leading member of the psychotherapy integration movement decades ago, when the idea of psychotherapy integration was a radical idea, when they actually had to form a society to try to bring people together from the dynamic and behavioral and cognitive behavioral schools and silos. As many of you know, Hal, after being Bill's teacher, became his student, in the sense of deciding to learn motivational interviewing and then to use motivational interviewing himself, and began writing about it, and particularly in the area of depression. And at a conference that I attended, when we were talking about MI, Hal said, motivational interviewing is a blend of client-centered counseling and behavior therapy, not cognitive therapy. And I think he's right about that. And if we were having a different conversation, I would go off for 20 minutes about that, but I won't. But MI is itself an integrative therapy, an integrative model. It takes two models and this was this client-centered and directive thing, that were originally thought of as opposites, as polar opposites, as integratable, and integrates them. And so when I first learned MI, I was trained to be, whether dynamic or client-centered, to be non-directive in the extreme. Any sort of advice, any sort of direction to the client was anathema to me for the way I was trained. And then I started learning MI, and this idea that you could be both person-centered and at certain moments share information, provide guidance or advice, and do it in a client-centered way. And this was, for me, a rather mind-exploding experience. And it was that experience that opened me to a much broader variety of models, and the recognition that I could, in fact, learn from and integrate the wisdom and therapeutic strategies from different approaches, and that would be better for the people that I was trying to help.
Wow. And I must confess that I'm, how can I say, really pleased in the way you describe MI as a force for integration, because in my bones, I feel it is. In my heart, I feel it that way. And I think you'll therefore appreciate why I've made such an effort in education and healthcare and sport to get MI out there, because, you know, Alan, there was a psychologist in an elite soccer club here in the UK who I mentor, and he said to me the other day, I asked him why he was interested in chatting about this, and he said, I'm searching for a language that I can share with other coaches in this club that allows us to speak about what it is to be helpful. And he felt that MI gave him elements of that language, not the whole thing, but there were words there that could provide a generic platform. And maybe that's a theme, if Joel allows us, is something we can develop in this conversation, not of a cocktail, but of, if you like, a foundational platform upon which, where there's a shared language, upon which conversations of a more specialized nature might take place. And I think the four of us are aware, I'm not, but many listening won't be, that Bill Miller and Terry Moyes have just produced a book on this very subject. So that is further fuel. There you go. Alan's showing what the book looks like. What's it called?
Effective Psychotherapists, Clinical Skills that Improve Client Outcomes.
So there you go, Berna. Alan's held it up, okay? And he'll hold it up again.
Sure.
There you go, effective psychotherapists. That's what it's called. Now, Alan, can I tell you a story? Comfort as I seriously and sincerely am by your reference to MI having the potential to support integration. My frustrated rant 20 minutes ago is born of this experience, okay? This polarization of cognitive and dynamic. I was aware of that in the 70s. It was like a polarization of the world of thinking and the world of feeling. I'm beginning to wonder, I think that might be it, when we know that feelings and thinking interact with each other. So, and I knew that back then, and I was sitting on the lawn of a psychiatric hospital in Northeast Scotland, okay? I can remember exactly when it was 1979. And someone produced a paper or a book on something called cognitive behavior therapy. No, sorry, cognitive behavioral psychotherapy, or it was the Journal of Cognitive and Behavioral Psychotherapy. And I remember guffawing then and saying, hang on, but that's everything. It's cognitive, it's behavioral, it's psychotherapy. That's wonderful. This is going to be, and this was in 78, this is going to be an opportunity to bring everything together. And someone, I can't remember who it was, cynically said, don't you believe it? The cognitive behavior therapists are going to run with this for decades, okay? Now it's 40 plus years later, and that is exactly what's happened, okay? And I recognize inside myself the personal gains that have come my way, having MI on my forehead. And I hope I've been kind of reasonably humble about it and not reinforced the silo. But I do notice other people in other therapies running with stuff because of the professional benefit to the individuals concerned, directing the research accordingly, trying to prove that one therapy is better than another, to the detriment of the recipients. My point is this, and then I'll stop. If that potential for integration was obvious in the middle 70s. And it was there in Bergen and Garfield's wonderful book about what effective therapy and helping is. And that book was in its second edition, probably by 1978. The first edition's probably 71 or 69. Okay. They made this case very clearly. So what are we making the case for now? It's exactly the same. So, you know, you say we've come a long way, but it's 40 years later and we're in the same quagmire, for God's sake. Okay.
Chris, I see you down there smiling, at least on my
I
screen
just-
down there.
I
What are
just
you
like
thinking
Steve's
about?
rants, but whatever we can do to have more of Steve's rants, that's my favorite part of any day.
Oh,
I'm
yeah,
just
yeah, that's-
joking, guys, but I do feel passionate about this, actually.
I'm
because
I'm creating a Steve Rollman mashup of all his rants.
No,
That's going to go on YouTube.
No, but
But
seriously,
Chris, what are you thinking about?
yeah, Chris, what do you reckon, man? Come on.
I suppose, you know, what I started with earlier is wherever we are is influenced by where we came from, right? So I, like a lot of people, started my career doing paraprofessional work, doing crisis intervention, suicide intervention work. And it was very Rogerian, active listening, you know, be non-directive because you're in the middle of somebody else's crisis and you've got no business figuring out what to do other than help them get through this moment. Some years later, my first therapy that I learned was a client-centered behavior therapy and used a model stress inoculation training. It was very behaviorally focused in content, but it was very client-centered, person-centered, interactive, in that it was up to the client to figure out what, you know, what their stressor was for them, what was causing it, and what, you know, they thought was a good path to go forward. So in my heart, I've never really understood the silos and the big debates in the psychotherapy field about these, and you know, the old if all you have is a hammer thing. And I feel that some of what's happened is people who are proponents of an intact system sit down and debate with each other. And it's interesting, and I think it's often intellectually stimulating. But like in this room, I just had this room renovated. It never crossed my mind to go out and look for someone to work on this room who used a particular type of saw and only that type of saw, and wouldn't use any other saw to cut wood in this room. You know, what I wanted was a person that seemed like they were going to show up. They cared about me. They cared about what my vision for the room was, and they would use the tools in the moment that needed to get it done. And I know it's an imperfect metaphor, but it feels like the way you started this, Steve, was a plea for people to us to figure out who can be helpful to them, who can be supportive, who could help this person's partner. And that as much as possible, I want to keep that mindset of it. I think that I won't go so far as to say there is no such thing as different treatments or psychotherapies, but all of them are clusters of interventions and clusters of components. And if we did a Venn diagram, some of them, you know, probably the most important elements overlap. And, you know, there's a lot of discussion over the years about common factors, et cetera. And those, unfortunately, I think for me have been too specified in some ways, but in almost all cases, if we're talking a one-on-one interaction, it's two people sitting down, one intending to help the other, having a somewhat focused conversation. And some approaches maybe doing some things, doing some homework, doing some exercises, or in other approaches, doing things in the moment between people to kind of shake it up and loosen it up. Gestalt empty chair technique, whatever it might be. But I suspect that there is not nearly as much difference between all of these models and therapies and treatments as has been kind of claimed by the people who have been their proponents. And, you know, I think there's I think it would actually be interesting to get into from my point of view, some of the history of in psychotherapy, how it came to be this way. There's this idea that there's all these different approaches, but I'm not really sure that the evidence supports that. I think that, we have much more shared interventions, much more shared outlook on what we're doing with people, and that the differences are kind of exaggerated. So I'll just put that out there. I have other background stuff on that, but figure get some debate going.
You could, but I'll hold my thoughts for the moment.
Well, I was just thinking, listening to Chris, you and Alan kind of talk about, coming into the field, and we're all basically the same age. I'm going to be, I don't know, how old am I going to be this year, Chris? 59, 58. How old are you, Chris? You're not saying, okay.
Younger than you, that's all I know.
Yeah, no, that's fine. We all came into the field about the same time, and I was fortunate that my dad was a psychologist and he was a humanistic oriented psychologist. And I guess just saying that is moving towards a silo. And I remember I told him I was going to graduate school in psychology. And he said, that's great. He said, I'm going to give you 2 books. He gave me Client-Centered Therapy by Carl Rogers and Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And he said, you probably ought to read these before they get to you. And then I came in working through the field of addictions back in the late 80s, and addiction treatment was fairly integrated, if you will. It wasn't just one thing. It was family therapy. It was addiction-oriented therapy. It was CBT. It was a lot of other nonsense that they did at the same time. So I don't ever think I had a time like when Alan had, when he felt like, he was a purist. I don't think I've ever been a purist at anything in my life. But I've never been a purist as a psychologist. I've always read and thought outside of what I've been practiced. But I agree with you. There was something about, Alan, there was something about motivational interviewing that was a crystallizing thing for me, because it wasn't something totally new, but it was something a little bit different. It was like, a second cousin that I'd never met before. And so I've never had an issue with stepping outside of a particular field of thought or a theory and felt like I was breaking a rule. In fact, it's more been, how do I go about learning something competently enough that I feel like I can integrate it with something else I know.
Yeah.
As opposed to what Gordon Allport, and in one of his books years ago, talked about eclecticism, is basically a little bit of this and a little bit of that, just having gimmicks to put in. So that, I guess that's where this conversation has brought me thinking for sure. And I tend to think I agree somewhat with what Chris was saying, in that as human beings, we're more similar than different. And I would wonder, if you look at psychotherapies and you try to look for commonalities and common mechanisms of action, if you'd find the same nuggets of gold in each one. They just are facilitated differently.
So I want to introduce a little tension here, as I'm wont to do, if I can, and because I think you mentioned that distinction between eclecticism and integration, Joel, and I'm not, for me, that difference is important, and I'm actually hearing a lot more, I think, a disciplined integration of different aspects from different approaches within a common framework is a different thing than sort of taking this from here and that from there. I think MI is an integrationist an integrative therapy or model, precisely because so much effort has gone into thinking about and specifying, what is, what are we doing? What is the client-centered or person-centered aspect? And what are the more, one might say, behavioral aspects? And where do they, when do you use what? When are you doing what? You're doing different things at different times in the conversation or different points in your work with the client, depending upon where they are in their readiness for change, for example. And I think it's an important, for me, this is important because I think it's also possible to overestimate the similarities between therapies. And I'll just talk briefly about one, which is at the extreme end, which one of the gifts that one of the great gifts MI gave me in my career was the opportunity to work with specialists in different therapies and different approaches who wanted to integrate MI into what they were already doing. And they brought me in to work with them to do that. And the therapy I'm thinking about is exposure and ritual prevention for obsessive compulsive disorder, which is as much of a classic behavior therapy as is possible to imagine, developed by Edna Foa, who herself, and I saw some references in the chat to therapies and the personality of the therapist. And the EXRP expresses the personality of Edna Foa as purely as possible. It is an extremely directive, expert-driven therapy of telling the client what's causing the problem that they have, the obsessions and compulsions, obtaining their agreement to do the procedures of the therapy and to do them in a really strict, focused way over the course of a relatively brief period, twice a week. It could be twice a week for 7 weeks or something like that. And the therapist's job is to ensure that the client does the activities of the therapy correctly. And the commitment of the model is that it is the exposing oneself to triggers of obsessive thoughts and resisting the urge to ritualize, to alleviate the anxiety that results in the treatment outcome, the effect of the treatment. And if you ever had the opportunity to watch tapes of recording, video of EXRP therapists doing EXRP therapy, it's hard to imagine a therapy that's further away from the person-centered, client-centered, or MI consistent model. And when I worked with a psychiatrist who had studied with and worked with FOA to integrate MI into this therapy, the biggest challenge was, or one of the big concerns was, don't let this MI stuff dilute the power of the behavior therapy. That if you begin, for example, exploring with the person their ambivalence or trying to help them resolve their ambivalence about doing an exposure,
Yeah.
as opposed to simply telling them this is what you need to do and do it now. And I know it's scary and I know you don't want to do it, but do it, because if you do it, we talked about why it's important to do it and to do it in this way, that you will actually get worse outcomes. So I think there are differences between therapies, and I think there are different assumptions that are made by different therapies about the nature of human beings and the nature of change and what produces change and what causes the problems that require change, that are important to think about together and to try to find the places where there are underlining connections. but I think it's important not to dismiss the differences, because if you just,
Wow.
I'll stop there.
That's so interesting.
Steve, do you want to catch Terry up on where we're at in the conversation?
Sorry, I'm late. I just got the message just now, read my email that we were starting early. I'm so sorry.
Fine, Terry.
No,
and,
no worries, Terry. No worries at
I'll
all.
bring you in a moment and update you. I'm trying to hold on to what Alan has said, because the idea of a cocktail blending is clearly not. It's going to undermine the legitimate differences between different forms of helpfulness. And Alan also talked about maybe there is a foundation that does unite all forms of therapy. And it's that foundation we're going to turn to Terry with in a moment, okay? Upon which more specialist activity might take place. And it will be, Alan, the father of behavior therapy was a relative of mine. And I've sometimes thought that Joseph Wolpe was a relative, and I've sometimes thought that I've spent my whole career reacting against but I have more personal reasons why I became interested in MI, and I might at some point in this webinar articulate that, because I recently went into very intensive, brief, short-term psychodynamic therapy, and I had someone pointing their finger at me and saying, "You have repressed anger all your life. What are you feeling?" And I'd say, "I'm feeling a bit numb." "You see, you're feeling angry and you're not expressing your anger." Now, this is so counter to everything that I've ever believed in. It's been one of the most useful personal experiences. And I've suddenly seen my whole journey of MI as being a soft, easy, empathic journey away from some real issues that I've never tackled. So that's about as deep as I'm going to go for now. But I'm hoping it'll prompt people like Alan and Chris to kind of go, "Oh, hell, right. Okay, so there's, there's some legitimacy to exploring emotion, okay, which is what we could well speak to later. But look, people, we've got 4 white men here, and I've been shuddering a bit because, it wasn't intentional. We wanted Terry to be up here at the beginning. I've invited Kathy Goomis to come on as well. I haven't checked whether she wants to, but we will bring Kathy in. Yeah. But Terry, listen, let me just put it this way. Okay. We've shown the cover of your book. It is incredible to have you with us, Terry. Really, it is.
Thank you.
And what about this, Terry? I told the story about how in 1978, it was quite apparent to a group of us psychologists that therapy integration was there for the taking. 78, we were all immersed in Bergen and Garfield. And someone cynically said, "I bet you that's not going to happen, because CBT is now going to be a wave that's going to wash itself over, the psychological treatment field." And looking back, they were quite right. I thought they were grumpy and misguided, but looking back, they were quite right. Could I put it to you this way, Terry? There was this case for integration in the 70s, possibly even the 60s. And you've just written a book with Bill that speaks to integration. What's changed, and what's in the book that you feel is a useful contribution to this discussion? How's that?
Lovely, thank you. I am just sitting here and just listening to the little tiny snippet I've gotten so far. My mind is just brimming with thoughts, which reminds me how fun it is to talk about psychotherapy to people who are actually interested in that topic. It's just a joy to hear all these ideas. The direct answer to your question, Steve, let me take a digression first, which is why I think psychotherapy integration didn't really work or really take off, which I think is because we don't know what the active ingredients of treatment are. So we can't, when we start integrating treatments, we begin squabbling in the absence of data because we don't know, okay, well, what are the elements of EXRP that really work? What are the elements of motivational interviewing that really work? And if we knew the answer to that, we would be in a much better position to integrate them, because we say, okay, we'll take the active element from this one, or we'll take the active element from that one. But we're just squabbling about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin because we don't have any data to inform us. So I think that's why psychotherapy integration, it doesn't really work as well as it could do. It's such a great idea. It's really where we need to go as a field, but it requires a kind of research and a kind of investigating that we haven't been very good at. And when we have done those kinds of studies, what we find is the things that we think are the active ingredients, actually there's not much support for that. So if you read studies about, mechanisms of action in CBT, it's like, well, there's not really strong evidence for the things that are supposed to work in CBT. I mean, there's a great study by Morgenstern was one of the authors, and of course the other one is eluding me right now because I'm getting old, and in which they investigated two types of therapy, CBT and interpersonal skills. And what they found is that acquiring skills in either of those areas and domains improve your outcomes, but the acquisition of those skills wasn't related to the treatment you got. So if you got interpersonal therapy and you acquired better social skills or drink refusal skills that you would have learned in cognitive therapy, you got better. And if you were in CBT and you learned any of the skills of those two therapies, you got better. But being in the therapy didn't indicate whether you were going to get those skills or not. And there are lots of studies like that. There are some really good EXRP studies showing that actually getting the therapist delivered exposure, and again, this is therapist delivered, doesn't necessarily predict better outcomes. So there really is a much more complicated interaction between the person interacting with the therapist and the environment to get the things they really need. And to get the juicy part out of it, which reminds me so much, Steve, of what you were talking about when you described your recent experience with having, had a finger shaking at you. So I'm really interested lately in the work of a man named Robert Hatcher, who's writing about a concept called responsiveness, and how it is the therapist's ability to actually assess and deliver in real time different elements of treatments that are indicated for that person. And that sort of meta skill of knowing and delivering what the person needs is actually what separates the sheep from the goats when it comes to therapists. So I'm very interested in that concept lately. Chris is laughing at me for saying that is that a cultural thing that people aren't going to understand in other cultures? Maybe.
I just liked it.
The wheat from the chaff, the good from the not good, all that. So all that I'm circling around to answer the question about what is it that are in our book that might be helpful in this context. And I think our book focuses on, both Bill and I are aware that there are technical elements, or believe that there are technical elements of treatment that work, like exposure and response prevention and learning social skills and so on. And we also want some equal attention to the therapist skills and the context in which those technical elements are delivered. And motivational interviewing is, such a great example of that. And I call motivational interviewing the royal marriage, because it really was the first therapy that equally privileged relational and technical elements. And there are a whole bunch of things that happened because of that I think were really life-changing and brought life to the area of psychotherapy research. But the point of our book is just to focus a little bit on that interpersonal skills balance and bring some attention to it and approach it in a rigorous way, where people are attaching data to those phenomenon in a way that helps us move the ball down the field to improve psychotherapy outcomes. Whew, that was a lot. You may have 4 white guys on the panelists, but you got one talky woman. So there we go.
Yeah. Well, it's just by default. Everybody that we asked was busy, so they ended up with 4 blokes and you.
Not far from the truth.
No, not far from the truth at all. People on holiday, they got to teach classes, they have to do other things. Chris, what are you thinking? And then we'll bring Kathy in the conversation.
Yeah, I was gonna say I saw Kathy pop up. So in some ways it's easy to focus on the differences even in the conversation when I think that there is, again, more overlap in what people are saying than actual differences. And to go back to the Venn diagram idea again, the overlapping pieces, Alan's saying some of the parts that don't have overlap are very important. And some of those are not just, as I understand it, not just the kind of momentary techniques, but the fundamental understanding of what is the purpose of sitting down and talking with someone or trying to help someone, and what vision of humanity do you bring to the interaction? And that's really important, and I agree with that. Terry talking about what are the processes, as well as what is the context in which interactions happen, but what are the processes that both are specified, are theorized or hypothesized to work, versus what, when we do get very often imperfect data, what do those data suggest are important? And I think that's also essential. And that's some of the stuff that's in the overlap of different approaches that hasn't been given enough attention to. So for me, to back up just a little bit, in the psychotherapy research world, I think there was a big reactance to a guy named Hans Eysenck back in the 1950s, posing the basic question, does psychotherapy work? And I'm not sure the field has gotten over the insult that apparently, sparked in so many people, the therapists who say, of course, psychotherapy works. But it took a couple decades for that to unfold. And it started with this idea of a uniformity myth that Don Kiesler introduced, that Eysenck's question said, implied that all patients are alike and all therapists alike and all therapies are alike. And so it was just not a good question. And he kind of launched us into, well, what works with whom? And then a guy named Gordon Paul, this is very American psychotherapy stuff and British also, but, expanded that to what treatment by whom is effective in this specific individual with that specific problem under what set of circumstances, and really complicated, right? So this developed what some people refer to as the grid model of psychotherapy research, where you have all these boxes. And so we've gone from a general question to psychotherapy work. Does this particular therapy done by that particular person in this setting with that amount of time and these techniques work? And while that is, I think, realistic that there are different answers, it's taken us completely away from the question of, is what we're doing working? And at least in my view, has been responsible for the kind of unfolding downward spiral failure of psychotherapy research to do its basic function, which is to say what's helpful to people. Because by the time you're in all these boxes in the grid, you've lost the searching for some sort of general answers. And I think that process research in psychotherapy research, I know we're into the technical stuff, Joel, but it's been differentiated from it. And yet one of the myths that Kiesler put forward in the 70s was that process research and outcome research are not different fields, that all outcome research, all outcomes involve many outcomes along the way throughout therapy, and processes themselves produce many outcomes. And so this separation into this field, and then the subsequent development of the randomized clinical trial as the, not just the gold standard, but really in many ways the only acceptable scientific model or accepted scientific model, has just kind of moved us away from some of the most important things that I think some of the research on MI has brought back. Terry's work, others' work, to say what's actually going on between people and what seems to be useful, I think are the key questions. And I think the next place I really want to see it go over the coming decades is into from the client's perspective, because it's so hard to figure out whose perspective to look at. And they often, depending on if you look at a provider's perspective versus an observer's versus a client's perspective, you often get really different views of what's going on.
Yeah.
And in the end, to kind of come back to Steve's question, what I'm hoping for is we find things that people find helpful for them, not things that we think are good, that science proves should work on average with a number of people with a particular kind of problem, but that we do find not just what do we do that can be helpful and we can kind of notice that in the moment, but the clients actually perceive as helpful, want to grab it, want to take it with them, and want to use those skills and those insights and those kind of processes for the rest of their lives, which is to me where it counts, not what happens with us, but everything that happens after.
I think you landed on something really important there, Chris. And I'm not going to jump into it because I'm really eager to hear what Kathy has to say about this conversation and her thoughts in this whole area as well.
Hi, I didn't expect to be on here, but hey.
What happens when you come to our webinar?
Yeah, it's lovely. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm just sort of listening with admiration and bewilderment, and all sorts of emotions are sort of flooding for me around this, because I sort of go back to the sort of opening where, you and Steve, Joel, promised to avoid a lot of psychologists speak. And, I hear a lot of research and a lot of psychological theories and a lot of, research, and I respect that immensely. However, my experience and the stories that sort of are percolating in my head as I listen to this, how do we be helpful? Where do we become helpful? And, Steve's lovely question about, what about the recipients? So my experience comes very much from that sort of frontline practice. And then throughout my career, I'm struggling and searching for ways of trying to be a better helper. I'm a nurse by background. I trained in some therapies. I refined my skills. I spent a lot of time really reflecting on what I was doing and how I was doing it and what was helpful. And when I met MI, it just sort of felt such a wonderful, a wonderful fit, I suppose, just to use that word, for me. And I took what I learned and I integrated it into what I did with lots of other things. And then my career took different directions. And I went into the world of organizational change and implementation science and quality assurance and management and all of those other, really complex, difficult, challenging environments. And my little rant in the chat that brought me on here for my sins was that it touched that button for me of, how do we help those practitioners who are helping others be better helpers? And that's really, to me, at the heart of it all. And involving, Chris, you've just mentioned, service users, the users of our services, being involved in this. And, that has been something I'm proud to say that within the part of the world that I live in, Northern Ireland, in mental health services in particular, we have, been getting much better at. And so for 20 odd years, it's been, a process of having the expertise of the service user inform what we do and how we do it and how we design services. And we're a long way away from, doing that well or to the best of our abilities. But the insights that I'm picking up along the way is that, the political arena in which we all operate plays a significant part in what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do, in our services that we all work in. And, what's funded, that's what's king or queen. And therefore, you know, it's almost this transactional mechanistic sort of culture that we are creating as a result of that. And therefore, the person at the center of all of this, that evidence-based practice that we talk about, and the research, how the research proves or disproves something, can have a massive impact on what is done at frontline level. And it can be for the good or the not so good. And that's a really an important tension, because it's at the expense of practice-based evidence, most in my experience. So that's where I suppose when I'm looking at blending and integration, I now, you know, help other people learn MI, and I'm sort of hopefully guiding their practices. And when they get curious about themselves, it's really that, it's that trust, it's that sense of connection, it's keeping it simple, it's creating a dialogue with someone in a way that's helpful and is devoid of arrogance and expertise. It's about meaning and connection. So I don't know, I've ranted, you brought me on, there you go. That's where I'm sitting at the moment. So I'll maybe
That's not a rant, Kathy. That was lovely. Thank you.
Well, it is a rant.
Steve, what were you going to say?
Why can't she be called a ranter? Because I have, so, you know.
It's the inflection in the voice that makes it a rant. She has that lovely Irish accent that she's just telling the story.
Yeah, you know, I'm going to have another look at your book, Terry, with a very open spirit, and I have looked at it, but I wondered what would happen if I look at your book and thought, what is helpfulness? Because I think that is a question that addresses, you know, Chris Wagner and my shared concern, and Kathy's as well, about the user. What is helpfulness? And Bill Miller and I are busy trying to put together what the 4th edition of the MI book might look like. And I'm interested to know to what extent we answer that question in that book, as opposed to creating more specialist variants of MI. And a couple of stories kind of washed over me while Kathy was talking, and I wonder if I could briefly tell you them, because I think they address this. They point to the fact that we might be very close to clarifying what helpfulness is. One is the sheer arrogance of professionals like myself, who in the early days of MI, when people used to say to us in training, "Oh, I do that every day," our reaction was, "Oh, no, you don't. This is something more special. Let me try and tell you," right? Now, looking back over 30 years, thank God I can see what they're getting at, because a lot of MI happens naturally. Okay. And that strikes me as very powerful, and it has for the last 4 or 5 years. I've been wondering, okay, so what happens naturally? The other story comes from elite sport, where I'll try and camouflage the source of this, but a player gets bought for well over 50 million pounds, okay, settles into this new club and doesn't perform. And the psychologist to my mentor says to me, I got approached by the coach saying, can you do something with this guy? Because he's cost us 75 million pounds and he's not performing. So the psychologist says, yes, sure. So he says, look, I'll refer him to you. Next time I speak to the psychologist, I say, what happened? He said, well, I haven't seen this guy yet, but I did say to the coach, will you have a word with him? Okay. The coach said, yeah, I'll do some goal setting with him. Okay. Now, this is a foreign player coming to a new country in isolation and lockdown in a big city, socially isolated and not familiar with the language and culture. Okay. And the coach is going to sit down and do goal setting with him. Okay. 2 weeks later, the psychologist and I are chatting again, and I said, you know, I was very intrigued because I know who the player is, and it's quite, you know, it's apparently very serious stuff in my little world, this, right? He says, yeah, it's interesting what happened, because the coach came to, by the way, the guy started suddenly performing brilliantly, right? The magic was happening on the field. He says to me, did you notice the magic has started happening? And I said, yeah, I noticed. It's brilliant. What did you do? The coach came to me. He said, the coach came to me and said, thank you very much for what you did with the player. He said, Steve, the problem is I haven't seen the player yet. Okay. So I said, well, what happened when the coach spoke to him? And he said, no, the coach did his goal setting, and he and I both had a twinkle in our eye. Okay. And we recognized what had happened, which was, the coach thought he was doing goal setting. The person himself experienced it very differently. He experienced somebody who cared about him, cared enough about him to sit down and say, how you doing, man? Okay. And so I'm wondering what is in Terry's book that's beyond that, because I'd really like to know. And I'm wondering what it is that we can add in the 4th edition of motivational interviewing that amplifies the kind of helpfulness that I think, you know, Alan and Chris and Kathy, we've all pointed to, and which, if you look at Gerard Egan's work from the 70s, I sometimes go back into that and my jaw drops for the quality of his answer to this question of what helpfulness is. And I think his model's called helping, or something ridiculous. It's Egan,
Yeah.
E-G-A-N.
Skilled helper.
It's called the skilled
Skilled
helper,
helper.
right? And to be honest, that's where I got the word focusing from for MI, was looking at, you know, thinking about what Egan was saying about how you focus. So, like, I feel very optimistic that if we're humble enough and we all just have a good look at Bill and Terry's book and try and pinpoint, and I'm not trying to sell your book, Terry, that's the last thing on my mind, but I have looked at it and felt like it's tantalizingly close to answering this question of helpfulness.
So,
there you go. There's a note of optimism despite my fear.
well, I'm pretty impressed at how quick time is gone. And I know that Marion and other people probably have some questions. Y'all, how about we take a few questions and see what
and David Price has got a question.
yes.
Why don't we open it up now for the last 10 minutes? I've put the link to the Guardians of the National Treasure in the chat line. If you would like, if you feel this has been helpful to you personally, why don't you make a gesture there? I promise you, it's not just charity, it's work that's got to be done. Okay, it's got to be done, the work they're doing, believe me.
So trying to think,
Joel's trying to operate from
trying to figure this out.
Yeah, he's going to try
so
and
Steve,
find
would you so we have lots of questions coming up, Steve, if you can start picking a few of them.
Okay, sure. Terry, I wonder how you reacted to what I said.
So a big burning question I have about MI in general is about the role of compassion and how important it is. And, you know, I tell this story a lot, that when you and Bill were writing the 3rd edition, I begged you not to put in compassion because I knew I could not code it. I knew I couldn't evaluate it, right? And I didn't want to have anything in MI that couldn't be evaluated, because then, you know, then it became religion, you know, and that was my concern. It really worried me. And it really worried me that people would say, well, if I don't have compassion, how can I do motivational interviewing, right? Can only a person that is a good person with compassion do MI, right? So
Correct.
for all of those reasons, I was, really, really nervous about having compassion in there. And then, you and I, Steve, have had some long talks about this, about whether a person really needs a good heart to do MI. And, I recall you coming down, I remember you saying to me once, we were having when I was arguing with you about this, and you said, well, maybe if a person doesn't have a good heart, they shouldn't be trying to do MI. And it was really, I just stopped short. I didn't know what to say, because that idea had never occurred to me, that maybe, some people shouldn't be trying to use motivational interviewing. I mean, I know some people don't ever seem to be good at it, but it never occurred to me that somebody shouldn't try to use it, and that one of the sort of entry requirements, or the things that the thing that would be important would be to have a good heart. And of course, I think you and Bill and I also agree, and I've seen this, that it can work the other way, which is that you start using motivational interviewing and then it really changes your heart, right? Your heart becomes more compassionate. So, but, I really hope you struggle with that question in your new book, because I think that's just, to me, like such an interesting question. So I don't know, I don't even know if that answered your question, but that's what I was thinking of.
You're not sure whether compassion is as important as we're suggesting?
Well, I think talking about compassion as a component of motivational interviewing, in my mind, splits it off from a large group of people who might otherwise try to use it, because they say to themselves, I'm not about becoming more compassionate, I'm about becoming more effective. And surgeons don't ask themselves whether they should have compassion for the people that they're cutting open. And, is that something we really want to ask therapists to do? Because if we do that, then we're really changing the focus of their work. And I think you and Bill intentionally wanted to change that focus, and we're interested in doing that. And I've become I'm a laggardly agreeer on that point. But I do think it really is one that we don't grapple with explicitly in our thinking about MI.
So Terry, what do you do with loving kindness?
Well, so what I think is that I have the tough job of picking apart components of therapy and trying to measure them. So what I do with loving kindness is nothing, because I can't measure it. Now, does that mean I don't think it's important? No, of course I do. The same thing with compassion, right? I think a compassionate MI therapist is a much better therapist than a non-compassionate MI therapist. But how do I evaluate that, right? That's my, geeky little misguided interest.
Well, I don't think it's misguided at all, but I'll just.
It's sort of striking me, Terry, listening to you, because it reminds me of a little story from me, I suppose, when I entered the world of what was called, it's now implementation science, I think is the word being used, but it was called service improvement. And I went and was successful and got this job as a service improvement facilitator in Northern Ireland. And it was sort of a part of the Department of Health, and we set up a wonderful program whereby we were offering a program of change for teams who wanted to improve their services, and there was no money aligned to it, and you had to apply and you had to sort of describe what it was you wanted to do. And I was just inspired by the whole selection recruitment process, because they posted an ad that just sang to my heart, and I applied for it, and I went very naively into this job because I didn't have any of these service improvement skills that, are needed. I hadn't been trained in them. And, but and I was coming from frontline practice, to be honest. Yes, as a nursing sister in a community addiction service, but that's what I was bringing with me. And I found myself in the first couple of days in a workshop called Capacity and Demand Analysis. And I was sitting there and I didn't even understand the language. And I'm thinking, this is the wrong job for me. I've made a massive mistake. This is wrong. But I persevered and I stayed with it, and I eventually mastered all of these other skills that I needed. But as we took these teams who applied to go through a year-long service improvement program, they had to really, focus down in. And the process, it was this process that Chris was referring to, which was so important to get the outcomes that they got. So as a team, the whole team, not just the senior members of the team, but the whole team and service users, it was 3 principles that they had to do, they had to sign up for. And that was to reduce waits and delays, improve communication, and involve service users in their service redesign. So that was what they were starting off with. And as we started to get together the idea, so I was working with a number of different project teams, they had to put this idea together. They then had to really think about, well, how are we going to do that? How are we going to know if what change we're making actually results in an improvement? And this is where I see the beautiful synergy between process and outcome, because as they grappled with that together from their different perspectives, they sort of had to think about, well, what's it going to look like? How's this, all those things that we're familiar with as sort of behavior change signs, okay? But then they had to figure out how were they going to measure it? So that was the tough one, because it was dead easy to count days and time and units, but that wasn't so easy to measure actual outcomes in relation to, where was the experience of the service user better? So how do we do that? So then that's where the measurement had to get a much more relational, much more human, sort of all of those factors. And it just sort of strikes me is that, and I know, I've been involved in conversations, and I think one of them might have been with you, Terry, around that whole sense of, research and the difficulties of trying to design a research project, and, how you measure it, and then how you, write it all up. It's terribly complicated. But then when it comes back to, well, what actually becomes a better helper? Well, in MI, we're looking to get that feedback from the service user we're with. That's who tells us whether it's helpful or not. So, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I do think that process bit, and therefore compassion and all those things that are less able to be units of measurement are we have to get much more comfortable, I think, with embracing that sense of difference and diversity, but at the heart. And this is where I think your book in particular, I don't have a copy of it quite yet because it hasn't reached this side of the pond, but next month I think it's going to be delivered. But I've heard you speak on it, I've heard you describe some of it, and I'm excited by it because it's as a practitioner, I think I can read that, and as a manager I think I can read it, and as a service designer I think I can read it, because these are things that we can see and we can help improve on. So that's, again, another little rant, sorry.
Chris, you want to do us a favor and try to summarize some of what we've talked about? What stood out to you? Things that have stood out to you?
I don't know. I mean, so many pieces, and I think that what I hear is most important is that we don't, I believe everyone's saying this, we don't get caught up in our own heads thinking about what we think is important. That we look for evidence, we look for other input, we think clearly about how these different pieces might fit together. And kind of going back to something Steve said earlier about when we do training with people and they say, I already do this, respecting that at least to a reasonable degree, that's true. And then also maybe looking for the things they also do that they're not really counting when they say I do this, but that end up undermining, the spirit of it. So that was not a very good summary, but the things that stood out to me.
Yeah.
Oh, Joel, we've got to that time in these webinars where the real stuff starts to happen as we decide to close. We've reached
So
the end of
why
our
don't we do,
time.
why don't we do what we usually do? Put in one more pitch for the Guardians. I've seen you've had them up there. And then we will keep chatting and maybe bring some more people up and just have a bit of a chat. Terry, if you need to go, just say adios. And we'll
I'm
just
free
carry
for-
on the conversation until we're done.
Yeah, I put the link to the Guardians in the chat line, and I won't say anything more other than to make an appeal to your generous spirits. Let me tell you, the day after these webinars, we often dance together, myself and Ralph Bohers in Cape Town. We often go online and he gets very excited. And so thank you very much. No more about that. There's somebody called Berna Elias who's raised a question about the use of MI with immigrant clients in a multicultural context. And that's got a freshness about it that, you know, Berna said she might be prepared to come on video and tell us about it. But that's after we finished, folks. I think we should give the last few minutes to each of our lovely people here to make a final comment. And I'm wondering whether I should pose a question to you or whether you'd just like to make a final closing comment. What do you think, Joel? Should we pose a question or should we just ask each of the people, give them 30 seconds to return to the question?
Pose a question, Steve. I like the idea of that. Particularly the person who gets it first.
Where are we at with integration? How's that? What do you feel about where we're at with integration? And you've got 30 seconds starting now. Alan.
I think we're in a place of enormous promise. I think work like Bill and Terry's book and others who work focusing on psychotherapy relationships that matter, the Norcross work points in the direction of where we need to do to achieve genuine integration. And I'll stop there because otherwise I'll talk for 20 minutes and not 30 seconds.
Chris.
Kathy. Oh, Chris, go ahead.
That's okay. Kathy.
Okay. I just say from an integration and practice point of view, I think we have a long way to go. Just for people to integrate it into their practice. I think there's lots more around that, again, that whole sense of organizational implementation that needs to support this practice. And if we were to audit, do an audit of people who are supposed to be practicing MI and did an audit of the clinical case notes just to see, okay, what was done. I think we have a long way to go if we were trying to recognize is MI happening, you know, from that type of what do you call it? Type of way that people do. They do an audit to see about fidelity or people, you know, practicing well. So they'll audit case notes. I don't see it there, and I think there's a long way to go. So that might be something for your book as well, Steve, is how, you know, how do the systems actually ascertain or confirm or whatever, you know, assure themselves that MI is being practiced, because if an audit of clinical case notes was done, would it be evident? What would that look like?
To steer us to the practice-based evidence that Kathy referred to earlier, I think we'd be even further along if we had more full-time counselors, therapists, helpers having the conversation, and fewer therapy developers, academics, trainers, teachers. I mean, you may not necessarily get better. I know Bill has made that point as a therapist over the course of your career, but I would put a little bit more money in the idea that if we talk to people who do this all day, every day for 10, 15, 20 years, we'd learn more about integration than we currently know. And I think maybe even, I think it was Terry in your book where I saw this about in these research studies where these different therapies are being known in some of the follow-up interviews, asking the participants about their therapist, they end up talking about the research assistant. I think that was in your book, that that's who they really identified as their main helper, was the person who called them on the phone. I don't know where that goes, but it's a handoff to Terry.
So I'm going to follow up on both of those, but particularly what Kathy said, which is that we're, and Alan, right? Which is that we do have a long way to go. And I see that happening because I think we're beginning to identify elements of treatment that are effective. And once we do that, people will want us to be accountable for it in a way that we really haven't been before. So therapists and behavioral health really hasn't been accountable for their outcomes because we haven't been able to measure it very well, but that's going to be changing. And so what I want to do is say the thing that will make that happen, which I see as a good thing, and the way that will make that happen is if we stop pretending we have a magic door. And the magic door is, right, therapy is a special thing and it can't happen and it can't work if you watch it. So therefore, I, as a therapist, am off the hook for allowing people to watch what I do and for being accountable for what I do, because I have to close the magic door in order for the magic to happen. And I really want us to consider that we're not going to make any progress in psychotherapy integration or psychotherapy effectiveness until we get rid of that myth and we start watching what we do with each other in a way that other professions do quite naturally and quite normally, in which we have a taboo in our field of psychotherapy. So I just want to put a plug in for getting rid of the magic door as a way of facilitating integration.
I have a couple of broad thoughts. One of them is that I think the future is more promising because I don't think people are ensconced in their theoretical camps as much as they used to be. I don't hear the arguments that Alan was talking about, and I hear people, flirting with different therapies, but I think people are more open to looking across their theoretical lines and bringing in other ideas. And I think the other thing that as long as we're teaching people how to think and not so much what to do, that'll bode well for the future of integration. If people are actually thinking about what they're doing it, why they're doing it, and what the outcome is that they're intending to get, I think that'll bode a lot better than I have a workbook or I've been trained in one thing and every client gets the same approach. But I do think it's imperative that we look at the client experiences, because different clients are going to experience two different therapists very differently doing the same thing. And so what are those differences that are happening for that one person? Could be a bit of a rabbit hole to go down, but it's certainly worth it. Steve.
Yeah, it's hard. It's a hard one, opening that magic door. When my recent intensive brief psychoanalytic therapist sent me a form saying she wanted to use a recording for teaching purposes, I said, no, I was scared. There you go. There you go.
It is.
All right. Look, we've reached that point where we're going to get very informal. The webinar is over in that sense.
Hey,
Yeah.
Steve, can I jump in for a second?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me just say that I just donated to the Guardians of the National Treasure, and the conversion rate is a nickel to $1 for US dollars, just in case those of you who are planning on making a donation would like to know that. And there's a currency converter on the site that does that for you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. That's wonderful. That's brilliant.
Absolutely. A little bit goes a long way. All right, folks.
Well, I want to.
Somebody you'd like to bring up, Steve? I've been
Well,
banging on about how about the person that you mentioned right off? And then
I
maybe
want-
if Paul's still here, we'll get him to come up.
Say that again, Joel.
The woman who you had mentioned who was doing motivational
Right.
interviewing and with
Yes.
immigrants.
Yes.
Berna,
Well, what was her name again?
Berna.
Doing MI,
BER,
doing MI with what?
immigrant population.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, got it.
And I want to apologize to David Price while Joel tries to find Berna, because the words you use, pluralism and integration, they're tough for me, David. I don't really know what pluralism means. And I worry about plunging into a rather refined academic discussion here. But if you'd like to come on, David, please raise your hand. Berna, you need to put your mic on. Hello, Berna. Tell us who you are and where you are. And if you have a question, then tell us, but it's lovely to meet you.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be on this webinar with you. So my first, excuse my English, it's not my first language. So I live in Canada, Montreal, and I'm a new immigrant, and I work with parents of children who has a diagnosis of autism or intellectual disabilities. So I'm planning on working with MI and linking it or blending it with an approach that I don't know if you heard about the transcultural psychiatry, so something like that. But I was interested to know your opinion about linking motivational interviewing with an approach that is open to culture. I don't know.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
I was here.
You are being very clear, Berna. And I'm happy to share some observations with you, but perhaps somebody else on the panel would like to speak now, or okay. Berna, there's been a discussion in the MI field about, does it cross cultures? And there've been some studies, not that many, but there've been some studies, and there is the sense of optimism around that the use of MI can cross cultures. I have had personal worries about this for many years of working in Africa. And so I never used to use the word motivational interviewing because I felt it was kind of arrogant almost. But actually looking back, I think I was mistaken, because I met and worked with a group of people in South Africa. In fact, Kathy was with me just a year ago in Cape Town, where it was frankly extraordinary how readily they saw the value of motivational interviewing. And for the first time, it became clear to me what it was that they found useful and that seemed to cross cultures, which I could speak to. But I wonder what makes sense to you. What have you noticed that might be helpful in motivational interviewing? I guess that's a question to you, but I don't mean to put you on the spot.
No, I don't know. I'm still in the beginning of my thinking, brainstorming, and yeah, I practiced motivational interviewing. I'm very I'm a beginner. I practice it in Kuwait, so and in a different, not in a Western society, but and yeah, I know it's the techniques, the strategies works well, but I was thinking about how it would work when we have different how can I put it? Okay. It's really when we work in a group as well, like, because when we talk about children with diagnosis, so we have a multidisciplinary team who works with them. So, and maybe each team member comes from a different background. And sometimes we go into the house of the home of the child, and we enter their space. I don't know.
It's I can see the challenges there, and what's increasingly striking me, and I think this was the experience I had with Kathy in Cape Town, was that there can be a power dynamic where the provider knows the solutions and it renders the recipient passive. And what's attractive about MI is the adjustment that, and then with that attitude and with the set of values that drive it, you see a person first, patient second, which is what Mats Hogmark, who's made a number of comments in this webinar, is saying surgeons should be taught about compassion. I think what he's saying is surgeons should see the recipients of their efforts as human beings first, and a patient with this or that problem second. And with those lenses on, so to speak, if it's a person first, it allows for the kind of connection and helpfulness that MI thrives on. And that's what I think Kathy and I witnessed in Cape Town, along with one other thing, which I'm very pleased that we've come up with this in MI, which is that when you establish that balance, you don't sort out the other person's problem using the righting reflex, that can have its limits. That's what struck them in across diverse cultures we were working with in Cape Town, that to step in and solve problems, a bit like the football coach I referred to, actually what was helpful was him leveling off with this player and treating him as a person first. And so maybe that's the fundamental attitude from which all else follows in some kind of integrated foundation that we're trying to seek, because it establishes what Kathy talked about, a foundation of trust. And I think that's what appeals to people in MI. It's the leveling off with them and not solving every problem for them. And then the question of okay, it doesn't mean I don't have expertise. I'm a guide. I can present you options, but I champion and empower you. I champion your choice and your wisdom in knowing what the next best step is. Now, if what I've said makes sense, then the football coach can learn that, as well as somebody in your multidisciplinary team, as well as anyone. I don't know whether that makes any sense.
Yes, thank you.
You know, Steve, what strikes me as I listen to you, as is so often the case for me, is that the underlying stance, you know, even more, you know, than talking about empathy or prizing, which both of which are so important, is an attitude of humility. And I think it's that I've become more and more convinced as I've trained different practitioners in different settings and different interventions, and done them myself, is that that's the underlying, in some ways, that's the sort of common thread of people who can learn MI and do it well, or people who can be helpful in other ways and do it well, is that stance of really being first aware of what we don't know, and of what of that we're not the expert on not only the life of the person we're talking with, but even in some ways on ourselves, on our and that willingness to not know, and that embrace of a stance of wanting to learn.
And you've taken this actually a step further, Alan, because I vividly remember in one of these webinars, you talking about looking up in an admiring way at someone. So, I mean, I'm talking about a leveling off, but actually I found it very powerful when you pointed out in relation to affirmation. It was the webinar on affirmation. I found it incredibly powerful, your reference to actually you're looking up in admiration of this person.
I just I was just up in Alice Springs, up in the middle of Australia, the Northern Territory, and doing training, motivational interviewing training with remote workers who are working in the Aboriginal communities that are anywhere from 500 kilometers from Alice Springs. So these are very small, 250, 300, maybe 500 people communities where the workers go and live. And they came down for the training and had a very similar experience that you talked about, that you and Kathy had. That there was some non-specific things that were happening in the training that was connecting up with what folks are already doing, and then gave them a language to talk some of what they were almost intuiting, and gave them some more direction to go with the conversation. But nobody said this isn't going to be applicable amongst the Aboriginal population that we work with, where in some of the communities, English is a second language, right? So I would love to see somebody doing motivational interviewing in the local dialect with somebody and getting that translated to see what that looked like. But what it is that it's meeting people where they're at and not coming in with all the solutions. And that's been my experience working and having the opportunity to train people from all different walks of life, is that's what people tend to resonate with. That even as a trainer, that I'm not coming in with the solutions. I just got some ideas that I want to share. And that's kind of the way I interact with my clients too. I don't do motivational interviewing with every client I see. In fact, I rarely do full-on motivational interviewing. But do I listen out for language? And am I aware of things like ambivalence and discrepancy? Yeah, definitely. And because I asked somebody, you know, how would this improve your health? That doesn't mean I'm doing MI. It just means that's an ingredient that can be really helpful. And I go back to kind of what I said earlier. You know, the first step is to learn as best as you can how to do motivational interviewing, and then bring it to the context that you work in and see how it can be adapted or integrated into that context. Dare I say blend.
Okay.
I think it's lovely, that sort of sense of what's coming together for me, of those pieces, Bern, of the jigsaw puzzle. Your question was around about, do you know, your thinking at the minute is forming, and this is, these are families where they're in an unfamiliar place, disconnected from everything that's familiar to them. And you're in this position where you can sort of be helpful to them. Yeah, that's ultimately be helpful to them in some way.
Yeah.
And this, where am I suppose, in the where are evolving thinking around a theory, around that evolutionary sense of how we can create the conditions so that everything quietens down, that this sense of having to be hyper alert because it's all so unfamiliar, and you know, I'm alien and I'm not from here, and I don't belong, I'm not from this place. All of those things that keep us on the margins and keep us
Exactly.
connected. And then I think this is where I think it's more than just that sort of atmosphere that we create purposely, but that we then invite. We invite their thoughts, their you know, it's a sense of what we're talking about, and Steve mentioned about tapping into that wisdom, and what Joel's mentioning about, you know, they have brought from their displaced people, but they have brought a huge amount of wealth of wisdom and their familiarity. So getting curious and inviting and exploring together in a way that helps them assimilate their thinking about how they may survive and flourish and thrive in this new place. That's just what was going on for me. So I think you're on a winner there in your thinking.
Yeah, I think, bye, Terry. Thank you
Bye,
so
Bye,
Terry.
Terry. Thanks so much.
I think Terry might be cross with you just as well. She's gone, because I can share a quick story with you. She's going to be cross with me for saying this, but because it stretches elevates compassion to levels that are mind blowing. But we, you know, Shona Hodson, I don't know if you're still with us, asked a question about technology and the use of technology and delivery of MI. And I had to write a chapter on remote use of MI for a book that I'm just finishing. And I didn't want to do it from an expert perspective. So I asked my close friend and co-author, Chris Butler, whether I could go and sit with him for a day. So we drove up into the Welsh Valleys, into one of the most deprived and marginalized communities, where he works as a general family physician. And I spent most of the day sitting there watching this man on the telephone. And his use of reflective listening and, you know, very good MI consistent consulting with the most bizarre range of constellation of problems among people who were right on the margins. And we went for a walk afterwards. And I said to him, listen, do you mind if I ask you some questions about your behavior on the telephone? He said, sure. And I said, listen, we're both South Africans, so we can talk very directly to each other. I said, listen, there was one thing about your behavior that I found a bit odd. And he said, what was that? I said, you spent a lot of the time with your head almost between your legs when you were talking to people. You know, you were bent over. The telephone was like bent over. And he said, Steve, it's almost like I'm praying. He said, it's a state of mind. I have to get into a state of mind to really tune into these people on the telephone. And I found that being in a almost like prayer-like position, the best way of really, really listening to a complex situation. And I thought that was very beautiful, because it speaks to the humility of someone working with folk on the margins, and that humility and compassion. You know, this is what Terry might think, oh my God, are we turning MI into religion or whatever? But I think that act of supreme compassion and humility on his part, and he was ready with all the expertise, Berna. I think that's can be the problem, is that people think, okay, if you're humble and you lose your expertise, which was simply not the case here. In fact, his humility went along beautifully with an opportunity to say to somebody, look, I'm going to have to come to your house in an hour's time because I'm that worried about you. So I'm coming and I'm going to knock on the door. So it's not like you're giving up responsibility. But the foundation is one of compassion and deep humility. So I don't know if that is in any way helpful, Bernard, but the more remote the medium, the more remote the person, the greater is the call for humility. I don't know. The more remote the medium and the person, the greater is the need for humility.
That rings really true for me, Steve. The work that I do now is primarily with helping practitioners who talk with people over the telephone, people who are very ill, to help them do advanced care planning, to think about end-of-life decision-making, essentially, and planning for future medical decisions. And it's all done over the telephone. And I think what you just described resonates so strongly with me, because that sense of, unlike when we see people face to face, they're coming into our space. When we're doing work over the phone, we're going essentially into their space. They're in their space. We're reaching across the telephone line to try to join them there. And they don't feel interestingly, the kind of intimidation that people often feel when they come into our offices, because it's, our professional practice and we're the professional and so on. And it really requires of the practitioner an even greater level of humility and recognition of the need to set aside their, not their intentions, but their biases and their assumptions and about what's about to happen, to be present to the person through the telephone.
And Alan, there's a wonderful concept that was developed by somebody here in Wales called the inverse care law. Julian, his name will come to me. He was a family doctor, and I know Mats Hogmark is going to like to hear this. The inverse care law states that the people in the greatest need are the ones least likely to get the care.
Pretty much.
That's 1971. He wrote a paper on that, the inverse care law. And we're extending that and saying, therefore, if you see what I mean, that carries certain responsibilities. And I agree with Mats. So the person undergoing surgery is in such a vulnerable position. No question, absolutely no question. The more vulnerable and passive someone is, the greater is the need for. I don't know if that's helpful.
Everybody, I've got to run. Berna, thank you for bringing that question to us to get us onto this. Yeah.
Yeah, it's lovely.
This conversation about humility, I think, is an important one to have. And I think there's the individual humility Alan's referring to, and the kind of broader issues that are coming up, including in interprofessional teams, professional humility about our role and our perspective with the others. And then, of course, the issue of cultural humility of anyone we're working with, of respecting that we're not, in the spirit of motivational interviewing, we're not here to put these ideas into the person, but to use this as a platform to help elicit from them their own wisdom and their own goals and dreams. So thank you. All right, everybody, I've got to run. I got a baby to take care of.
Great to see
you all.
I will unfortunately need to go as well as I move on with the rest of my workday, but I've loved being with you all, and I thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Let's go ahead and pull the plug then, Steve. It's 1 o'clock in the morning here. And I have to get up and do a workshop.
You're a bloody hero. That's all I'll say. It's incredible, man. I agree with you, and thank you, everybody. I just had a rugby ball kicked over the fence, so it's clear that some of the children are
Hey,
wanting to.
sorry we couldn't get to everybody's questions because there are some lovely questions in there. But maybe we'll do another version of this conversation down the road.
Absolutely. We got the next one lined up, which is sparked by Berna, I think. So the next
Okay, great.
the next webinar will be on cultural things, Berna. So thank you very much for coming on board.
Thank
That'll
you.
be fun. I look forward to working that one out with you, Steve.
Yeah, we'll
All right,
make it
guys.
happen, Berna.
Kathy,
We'll get
Thank
Berna
Berna,
back
nice
on.
to meet you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Alan, my
guys.
friend. Kathy, my friend. See you later.
Bye. Thanks, Kathy.